What was life like in Germany immediately after the fall of the Nazis? Berlin, a city between endings.
Berlin, early July 1945. 2 months after the guns went quiet, the city still sounds like an echo. Since the end of the house-to-house war in Hitler's former center of power, the Soviet authorities have ruled the ruins and decided what comes next. Now, for the first time since the fall, British and American forces are allowed to move into their sectors as agreed. A small camera unit led by Hollywood director George Stevens slips into the Soviet-occupied heart at the Brandenburg Gate. They're not here for beauty, they're here for proof. At Paris-Platz, the lens finds the wounded legend of a city, the Hotel Adlon. Once Berlin's most elegant address, it served as a military hospital during the fight for the capital. Only days after the German surrender, it caught fire and was left uninhabitable, a hollowed-out frame where society once dressed for dinner. Around the corner on Unter den Linden, another ruin slumps into itself. The boulevard is technically passable again. Bicycles, of all things, have become a luxury. Stevens climbs into a jeep and poses at the gate, as if to prove to himself he is finally in the place where the world split. He would have filmed Hitler's last days if he'd been allowed to enter sooner. But the Western press had to wait until July, then step into a metropolis trying to build a life out of ash. The Allied cameras will now document the defeated after 12 years of Nazi rule and 6 years of war. Debris crews are everywhere, lugging bricks in lines that feel like punishment and penance at the same time. The last battles, the bombing raids, the terror in the streets, already some try not to talk about it. It's unclear what comes next. In just over a week, the victorious powers will meet in Potsdam to decide the future. Berlin waits, watching the clock. But before the leaders sit at a table, another capital will show what victory looks like when it needs to be staged. Red Square, a victory made visible. Moscow, June 24, 1945. 6 weeks after Germany's capitulation, the Soviet Union throws a triumph in stone and music. Before the walls of the Kremlin, the country hails sons and daughters who clawed a victory out of winter and fire. From Lenin's mausoleum, Joseph Stalin accepts the salute of a nation and presides over the Red Army's grand parade in Red Square. For 4 years, he demanded everything. The bill is unspeakable, about 27 million dead in the Great Patriotic War. The parade is a lesson in symbols. Nazi standards are flung down in front of the Soviet leadership, as if to say the ideology that promised 1,000 years has been reduced to trash at Stalin's feet. The Red Army celebrates itself and the version of the future it insists on. Stalin stands at the peak of his power. With the army behind him, he will cement the USSR's status as a superpower and shape the map far beyond his borders. Back in Germany, the camera climbs into the air and looks down at what Hitler's future actually produced. Aerial of a wound, numbers that don't fit in a frame. July 1945. From above, Berlin is a sea of broken teeth. During the war, roughly 50,000 tons of explosives fell on the capital. About 48,000 buildings are destroyed, 23,000 are severely damaged, and 172,000 carry scars, numbers that stop the mouth. The British Air Marshal Arthur Tedder visits and tries to describe the indescribable. He suggests the ruins be preserved as a modern Babylon or Carthage, a monument to militarism and the horrors the city unleashed and then endured. The city is completely dead, you say, he says. Kilometers of abandoned streets, nothing habitable. Berlin can never be rebuilt. The New York Times wonders aloud if the obliteration might be the first step toward a different, better Germany. A visitor writes that very few would mourn the disappearance of this unlovable parvenu among Europe's capitals. The American journalist William Shirer puts it plainly in his diary. How can you truthfully portray a great capital destroyed beyond recognition? The image of a once mighty nation that has ceased to exist. A people who only 5 years earlier swaggered as masters of Europe, now reduced to carrying buckets and standing in lines. And yet, in this wasteland, Berliners begin to move with intent. Because despair finishes nothing. Rubble women, the first builders of the new city. On July 7, 1945, journalist Ruth Andreas Friedrich writes in her diary, "The whole city lives in a frenzy of expectation. One wants to tear oneself apart with eagerness to work, to have 1,000 hands and 1,000 brains. Rumors gallop. The Americans are here, the British are here, the Russians already hold the gate. The French, maybe soon. No one knows exactly who controls which bloc. What matters is that Berlin sits at the center of the next act. About 2.8 million people still live here. Women dominate the streetscape. The Trümmerfrauen, the rubble women, take stone after stone out of the mountains of wreckage and stack them to build a future. It is cleanup as survival, a job that will last years, and most of the men are dead or in prison camps. The camera of Special Film Project 186 follows the rhythm: lift, scrape, pass. On July 9th, Captain Carter films Berlin women and children who, for the camera's narrow moment, look healthy and steady. For Eastern refugees flooding through, that steadiness is a dream. Shira sees them, starving bodies with only animal functions left. Find food, find shelter, get through the next day. Rations are meager, heavy laborers, workers in dangerous factories, and recognized cultural workers get the best of a bad system. Then come the blue and white collar employees, rubble women and children. Those without work get ration card number 5, the hunger card or cemetery card as people call it. Bureaucracy sorts life into categories while hunger gnaws outside the queue. Carter's official mission is to document bomb damage, but the truth is bigger than buildings. He tracks the places that made Hitler's rise possible. He frames the rooms where slogans turned into orders and then into graves. And one by one, he finds the addresses that became accelerants. The addresses of a dictatorship. The Kaiserhof and the Sportpalast. Wilhelmplatz. The Hotel Kaiserhof was Imperial Berlin's first luxury hotel and later a safe harbor for the nationalist elite. In the 1920s, it welcomed men who wanted to turn back the world. By 1932, Hitler lodged there on Berlin visits. From that suite, he planned his path to the chancellorship. On January the 30th, 1933, he left that lobby and drove to President Hindenburg to be appointed Reich Chancellor. These stones, remember. Across the city, the Sportpalast on Potsdamer Straße stands as a broken barrel. In February 1933, Hitler used its stage for his first major speech as head of government, promising to crush the Communist Party and hardening anti-Jewish fury into state doctrine. 10 years later, on February 18, 1943, Joseph Goebbels shouted, "Do you want total war?" To 15,000 party faithful. They roared, drilled in their answer, yes. 2 years later, total war walked into Berlin in person. In February 1945, a bombing raid tore up the Reich Chancellery. In April, Soviet artillery finished what the bombs began. On May 1st, the Reich Chancellor's last successor, Joseph Goebbels, offed himself here with his wife, Magda, clearing the path to unconditional surrender. Red Army soldiers scribbled crude claims and insults on stone, marking the end of a story that had always relied on spectacle. But the darkest question in these rooms still isn't answered in early July. The question of Hitler, rumors, evidence, and a silence that echoed. On July 9th, 1945, Berliners argue over what happened in that bunker beneath the garden. German propaganda had broadcast a heroic myth. The Führer fell in battle against Bolshevism. It's a lie. Inside the bunker, on April 30th, Adolf Hitler shot himself. Loyalists carried a body to an exit near the garden and drenched it in gasoline. Former security men would testify that they watched the burning from a tower. They would also say that the charred remains of Hitler and Eva Braun were buried in a shell crater. What happened next drifted into rumor, partly by design. Reports say that by May 5th, Soviet security agents had found the grave. Within days, dental evidence identified Hitler. Stalin was told. But, as accounts suggest, the Kremlin kept the news close. Why? To keep Western leaders uncertain, to preserve a useful fog over what had happened. When the Potsdam Conference opens later in July, Stalin will casually tell the Americans that Hitler might be alive in Spain or Argentina. Whether that was misdirection or mischief, it stoked a myth that would take decades to kill. While the truth evaporated in smoke and secrecy, a different truth stood visible in stone. The architecture of arrogance had been punched full of holes. The Red Army ended the myth of invincibility with artillery and blood. And yet, even in the Soviet sector, the posters spoke a gentler line than the streets did. Posters and promises, words on walls, fears in houses. Across conquered Berlin, the Soviets put up placards with Stalin's words. The Red Army does not and cannot harbor racial hatred. It respects the rights of other peoples, including Germans. In print, the statement reads like a promise of restraint. On the ground, fresh memories tell another story: looting, assaults, and a flood of abuses in the first weeks after the city fell. Ruth Andreas Friedrich writes, "Politicians forget the simple rule: you win people by offering better than before. The crowd hails the liberator, the savior from evil, because they added to their misery." In her view, the inhabitants of the East Zone now hate the Russians. The Americans, she predicts, will approach differently. The British too. She's not wrong about the different tone to the West, and a symbol of aspiration still stands almost untouched. Symbols that survived, the Victory Column and a boulevard of bargains. The Siegessäule, the Victory Column, still rises beyond the gate, now in the British sector. Berliners nickname it the Goldelze, the Golden Lizzie. The Union Jack has flown nearby since July 1st. For a people who have lost almost everything visible, an intact column becomes a strange kind of comfort. Even stranger is what sprouts under the gate itself, the city's largest black market. The Tiergarten offers cover. The border to the Soviet sector is only steps away. If a raid starts, sellers can vanish into trees or across a line. People bring whatever survived the fire: rings, coats, a single good shoe, and try to trade it into calories. Officially, the Allied authorities denounce the barter economy. Unofficially, everyone knows winter is coming, and ration cards aren't enough. Raids happen. The black market returns the next day. The Soviets place a Berlin police chief who has returned from Moscow, Karl Marron, over the East's new force. He's tasked with controlling the black market. Western officers suspect the men in those uniforms take orders first from Communist Party functionaries who flew into Berlin as soon as the shooting stopped. The Communist Party, banned by the Nazis, is readmitted in the Soviet sector on June 11, 1945. For now, most Berliners are too busy to care. Survival outruns ideology. But the split in the city's nervous system is already showing. And yet on all sides of the lines the work continues, brick by brick. Work for bread, 72 pfennigs an hour and a better card. On July 10th, Captain Carter films teams of rubble women clearing entire city blocks, earning 72 pfennigs an hour and a better ration category. Every brick they salvage is a piece of someone's future wall. The city's population is overwhelmingly women and children. The men in these scenes are either in uniform or missing from the frame entirely. That same day, Ruth Andreas Friedrich writes another entry, this time about leadership and what Germany has left after a generation of manipulation. Perhaps part of our misfortune is due to the fact that we have too few personalities. About 10% leaders, 90% led, she speculates, then asks what remains of that precious 10% after 25 years of upheaval. It's a painful question without a tidy answer. Carter notes one boy, 9 years old, parents gone, wandering the ruins looking for a brother. A single line that breaks your heart more than any aerial shot could. Refugee columns march through Berlin with carts and children and crates. Hundreds of thousands come from the east with whatever they can push. The city is already overcrowded. Many are told to keep going. Water comes from public pumps. Much of the groundwater is contaminated. Dysentery and typhus travel with thirst. Even the well-dressed prowl the streets, scanning for work, barter, or an empty room. In Dahlem, Zehlendorf, Charlottenburg, suburbs with intact villas, the British and Americans have requisitioned homes to house their troops. Berliners are displaced by the army of a country they're told will teach them democracy. Andreas Friedrich doesn't sneer. She understands the symmetry. Our soldiers have also seized quarters in Russia and France, but, she writes, only you feel it more bitterly when it happens to you. Evacuations come in hours. People carry what they can. When that door clicks behind them, they're totally bombed out, the phrase Berliners use for the completely dispossessed. Whether you were a Nazi or a resistor, rich or poor, if your address is needed, you must go. See if you can find a corner somewhere else. To help families find each other, Berliners scrawl messages on walls, new addresses, names, pleas for news. Some apartments survive despite damaged facades. That means life has moved outdoors. Dinner happens in view of strangers. Nights are dangerous. One wrong step in the dark and you fall into a bomb wound. Entire blocks are unlivable. Carter films a leafy street knowing the trees will be gone by autumn. Berlin will cut them for heat. Most roads are technically open, but there's almost no traffic. Private cars are scarce. Many were seized by the Wehrmacht long ago or now taken by the victors. At Alexanderplatz in the Soviet sector, people queue patiently for trams to the outer districts. An S-Bahn line resumes in early July. Each restart feels like a small defiance against the silence. The camera swings to a different symbol, one of the regime's proudest stages, and finds a different audience. Olympic dreams, occupation rules, the stadium and the Wannsee beach. Georgic curves, stone colonnades, the Olympiastadion sits in the British sector. In 1936, the United States almost refused to come. Under pressure, the regime agreed to let Jewish athletes compete, and the boycott lost steam. Jesse Owens took 4 gold medals and punctured one of Hitler's favorite fantasies in front of the world. In 1945, the pool next door was reopened, but not for Berliners. The new masters restored the swimming stadium for their soldiers. Germans are barred. The rule stings, but the message is simple. You don't get perks from the system you built to dominate us. Stevens and his team drive out to the Wannsee. The lakeshore has a holiday piece to it. Sunlight, water, a few bathers. Look closer. They're occupation soldiers and their dates, ignoring the ban on fraternization that was written to keep lines clear. Berliners are not allowed on this beach. Exceptions appear for attractive young women. Human nature steps around rules when it can. At the US Beach Club, 2nd Armored Division, Hell on Wheels, once under Patton, in Normandy and the Ardennes, there's even a golf course. 2 months after the Reich fell, Berliners carry buckets past craters while Americans drive tees into manicured grass. The contrast is beyond satire and exactly what empires look like in every century. Back at the gate, another show is ready to start. Parade ground, old uniforms, new masters, and cracks under the music. German policemen clear Pariser Platz for a British ceremony. They wear uniforms that predate 1933. In the Soviet sector, the police aren't fussy about biographies. Men trained under the Nazis now work under communist supervision. Somewhere between hypocrisy and necessity, the city keeps turning. On July 12, 1945, soldiers of the British Desert Rats, 7th Armoured Division, march across Hitler's east-west axis under the Brandenburg Gate. Cameramen from Special Film Project 186 roll film. This unit liberated Tripoli and Tunis in 1943, crossed the Rhine in March 1945, took Hamburg, and now marches in the city it once fought from the sky. The border between British and Soviet sectors runs through this very square. It is the perfect place to show unity. It is also the easiest place to see the fault line, Berliners notice. Ruth Andreas Friedrich writes that the Allies don't seem to love each other. You learn not to say it too loudly. Drop a hint to an American or a Brit that there were difficulties with the Russians and watch the air grow cold. Everyone knows the alliance is turning into something else. No one wants to admit it on the record. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery arrives to present Marshal Georgy Zhukov with a high British Order of Merit. They stand together for the cameras. The gesture is real. The gap beneath it is real too. Joint appearances are supposed to hide the crack. They only outline it. George Stevens didn't come for parades alone. He's here for the next table where history will try to order itself again. Road to Potsdam, a meeting and a test that changes everything. Churchill, Roosevelt and Stalin last met at Yalta. Roosevelt is gone now. Harry S. Truman has stepped into a role with no learning curve. The big three will gather at Potsdam to settle the questions that can be settled. Borders, reparations, trials, the administration of occupied Germany. Truman sees the Red Army across Eastern Europe and doesn't like the math, but he still believes a working partnership is possible. In Berlin's British sector, Stevens films a Red Army unit marching through the Tiergarten. Truman says publicly that America and Russia can be friends. For the moment, he means it. Incidents between GIs and Soviet soldiers pop up anyway. Friction is inevitable when uniforms from different systems share a city with no food and no trust. Even so, Truman opens his hand. Then, in the background, a flash in New Mexico writes a new rulebook. Just before Potsdam begins, the first atomic test, Trinity, succeeds. A weapon with the power to end wars and end cities has entered the room. On July 14th, Captain Carter films at Pariser Platz again. The question hums through the ruins. What happens now? Will the Soviets try to push their line west? Will the Americans go home, as Roosevelt once suggested? Or will the Western powers rebuild Germany and teach it democracy with an American spine? Treasury Secretary Henry Morgenthau had pushed the idea of deindustrializing Germany into a farm. War Secretary Henry Stimson fought that and convinced Truman that a stable Europe needs a productive Germany. Stimson's own notes from May are curt and tough. Punish war criminals severely, take away the weapons forever, supervise the government until the Nazi generation is gone, but leave the people a way to build a contented, peace-minded country. Ruth Andreas Friedrich adds the hope from ground level. Let four powers meet in our ruins and see we mean it. That we renounce Nazism, that we work, that we crave a moral repair. Never before have we been so ripe for redemption, she writes. The only question? Will the victors keep their promises? One of those promises arrives at Tempelhof on US wings. The delegations arrive, a city sealed, a briefcase full of history. Tempelhof was one of the first grand projects of the Third Reich. By 1941, its sweep of stone was the biggest building in the world by footprint. When US forces take it over on July 2nd, it's still a mess. So on July 15th, 3 US C-54 transport planes touch down at Gatow, the British airfield. On board is Truman's delegation to Potsdam, 4 times larger than the team that went to Yalta in February. Andrei Vyshinsky, the prosecutor of Stalin's show trials, and Ambassador Andrei Gromyko greet Secretary of State James Burns on the tarmac. Generals, liaisons, security, cooks, doctors, the apparatus of a modern presidency lands in a city still missing windows. George Marshall, the US Army Chief of Staff, supports rapid reconstruction with American help. Within 3 years, the program will carry his name and reshape a continent. Truman steps off the plane. In a letter to his mother and sister before leaving Washington, he wrote, "I have a briefcase full of information. I wish I didn't have to go." He goes anyway. Potsdam is sealed behind Soviet checkpoints. The stage is set at Sicilienhof. Before the conference opens, Truman meets Churchill at the Little White House in Babelsberg. Kirkby Lawton, the same army cameraman who filmed at Rheims, now films here with his amateur camera. Churchill has just lost his parliamentary majority and will be replaced mid-conference if the vote tally holds. He assumes Truman isn't Roosevelt and says so privately, but is quickly impressed by Truman's steel. Truman's diary is less sentimental. Churchill praised America, Roosevelt and Truman himself, to the point of absurdity. "I think we can get along," Truman writes, "if he doesn't butter me up too much." Stevens's camera rolls as Berliners push bicycles loaded with food on the road out to Potsdam. Andreas Friedrich hears on the radio that the 3 leaders have arrived. She prays the order will begin now, the end of rapes and seizures and improvisations that make dignity impossible. The meeting will prepare the ground for good to flourish. One of the powerful arrives to pay respects. Then words bend truth for convenience. Inside Sicilienhof, greetings, theatre, and the first agenda.
July 17th, Stalin visits Truman before the first session. Lawton's small camera catches a handshake. Truman will later call Stalin friendly, good-natured, businesslike, honest, and insanely smart. At some point, Secretary Burns asks the Soviet leader about Hitler's fate. Stalin shrugs off certainty, maybe Spain, maybe Argentina. It is theatre. It is also a hint of the world to come, where facts are tools to be used, not anchors to be tied to.
Sicilienhof is stately, the last home of a German crown prince now hosting men who dissolved his world. The Soviet camera team shoots in color. The Americans shoot from a gallery. Officially, the USSR is still neutral toward Japan. The Pacific War is the first topic. Stalin signals that he will join in and declare war soon. The conversation pivots to Europe, borders, reparations, administration, the daily business of occupation. Behind Truman's calm sits a new voice. The atomic test has succeeded. When he mentions it, the subtext fills the room. There is a weapon now that can change the tone of every sentence. On the terrace, the press sees smiles and hears generalities. The work happens behind doors. Out in Berlin, the Stevens team finishes its month-long sprint with aerial footage and street-level scenes of a city so broken that city feels like a euphemism. About 80 hours of raw color film go into a US Air Force vault and sleep for decades. No budget to cut it into a finished piece. History waits on funding. But the decisions from this table won't wait.
The Potsdam terms: 1 country, 2 systems, and a promise on paper.
The victors agree that Germany will not be carved into separate countries. The West accepts Stalin's claims over East Prussia and the lands east of the Oder-Neisse line. Expulsions and migrations are already underway and will only accelerate. The country is to be fully disarmed and demilitarized. The Germans will pay reparations, each occupying power, extracting value in its zone. war criminals will face an international tribunal. Denazification will be pushed zone by zone. Ruth Andreas Friedrich reads the headlines and lets herself breathe. Common policy in all zones. Agreement on a peace order in Europe. It took a load off our minds, she writes. No new war, not now. Common construction and common order. The final communiqué says the leaders leave with renewed confidence that their governments, together with the other United Nations, will ensure a just and lasting peace. It sounds almost too good to be true because it is partly that. A note that looks objective and sounds like hope, but flexes under pressure in every paragraph. Truman isn't blinded by paper. He sees the ruins and thinks of Carthage, Baalbek, Jerusalem, Rome, Atlantis. He thinks of Scipio, Ramesses II, Genghis Khan. I hope for some kind of peace, he writes, but fears that machines run centuries ahead of morality. Only when morality catches up will we stop needing this level of destruction. In that line sits the Cold War, unannounced but awake. Berliners don't write strategic memos. They write address lines on broken walls and spend afternoons in queues. They cut down their trees for winter and carry buckets up 6 flights of stairs because pipes are broken. They trade rings for bread. They show up at demolition sites for 72 pfennigs and an extra scoop of calories. They watch soldiers march in borrowed uniforms and try not to stare too long at the line across the square where the flags change. And the camera, patient and unsentimental, records all of it because people lie, but film doesn't. The Reich Chancellery revisited rooms where power died. With special permission from Soviet authorities, George Stevens takes his crew into the ruins of the Reich Chancellery on Wilhelmstrasse. Once, this was the corridor of fear, a place Albert Speer designed to overwhelm. When diplomats see this, they will learn to fear it, Hitler supposedly told his architect. Today, much of it is open to the sky. The gleam is gone. The scale looks absurd without the myth to hold it up. The garden, where rumor says a body was burned, is just dirt and whispers. What is certain, Joseph Goebbels and Magda Goebbels took their own lives here after poisoning their children. Their charred remains were recovered and displayed by Soviet authorities to end argument. For Hitler, the information was handled differently. Reports suggest Stalin decided uncertainty played better than closure. In rooms like these, you learn the tone of endings. Sometimes they are loud enough to shake the ground. Sometimes they are a whisper. The whisper can be more dangerous. The city outside does not have time to argue over bones. It needs water and bread and soap, so it keeps moving. A city improvises, pumps, trams, and hard lines. Berliners become experts at improvisation. Public pumps provide water, but with the risk of disease. Electricity flickers. Streetcars clatter to life on a few lines. The S-Bahn runs like a ghost of modern life. People queue at Alexanderplatz with patience you can only learn from loss. The wide boulevards that once held motorcades now host handcarts. In Dahlem and Zehlendorf, in Charlottenburg, and the near suburbs, there is still wealth, but even there it is on the move. Military requisitions knock on doors with paperwork. Apartments that survived the war acquire new tenants with armbands. The old owners leave carrying blankets and pots because no one wants to die of cold. On the steps of the Brandenburg Gate, British parades mass and disperse. In the Tiergarten, Red Army patrols march as if to reassure themselves they own the path. At Wannsee, laughter builds in foreign accents. At hotels, Berliners cannot enter. On the sidewalks of Unter den Linden, women in summer dresses look for a note of possibility. The black market thrums where the police are told to stop it and often do not. It is a fragile peace built on hunger and ceremony. Final frames, one city, two clocks, and a future in the balance. By late July, Stephen's camera has seen what it came for. It has stood at the gate, scanned unter den Linden, stepped through the chancellery, skirted the black market, watched the desert rats march, and pointed at a dais where Montgomery and Zhukov shake hands that grip too hard. It has watched rubble women pass a brick from hand to hand in a line long enough to be a prayer. It has caught a 9-year-old alone in a world too large. Potsdam ends with signatures and statements. Germany will not be partitioned, not yet. It will be administered, disarmed and judged. East Prussia and the Eastern Territories are gone. Reparations will be taken, trials will be held. The hope, stated clearly, is a just, lasting peace. The reality, unspoken, is that two systems are already testing where the other will bend. The atomic blast in New Mexico hums under every sentence. The maps look stable, the air does not. In Berlin, the Victory Column glints. The Hotel Adlon sits open to weather. The Sportpalast is a husk. The Kaiserhof is a lesson. The Chancellery is a carcass. The black market sells memory for calories. The tram rattles, the pump squeals, the queue advances a step. Ruth Andreas Friedrich writes one more hope: that the world powers will look into the ruins and believe the people who live there want to repair more than buildings. If only our victors will keep their promises to us, she writes. Redemption requires a partner. So does democracy. Special Film Project 186 packs its cans of colour film and heads home. 80 hours of Berlin in 1945 get shelved for decades in a US Air Force depot, waiting for a budget, a curator, an audience with attention. George Stevens will leave Germany with footage that proves what happened and how it felt. The numbers, the faces, the silence between words. History's endings are never smooth. They rumble and repeat. They leave two dates for one event. They leave a rumor where a fact should be. They leave a city that was taught to strut, now learning to queue. They leave a camera that refuses to look away. If you want to understand Berlin in July 1945, don't start with a treaty. Start with a woman holding a brick, a soldier in a borrowed room, a boy looking for his brother, and a poster on a wall promising respect that did not come soon enough. Then put them together. That's the story that grips and doesn't let go.